There is a moment that nobody warns you about. It does not arrive with drama. It does not announce itself the way breakdowns do, with tears and shaking and the kind of visible collapse that at least has the decency to explain itself. It arrives quietly. You are sitting across from someone you have known for years, a friend, a family member, maybe a partner, and they are speaking and you are listening. And somewhere in the middle of their sentence, you realize something that changes everything. You realize you are not actually there. You are performing, being there. You are doing the thing you have always done. The nodding, the leaning in, the carefully measured expressions of concern. And underneath all of it, underneath the performance that you have rehearsed so many times, it became automatic. There is a stillness that frightens you, not because it feels like emptiness, but because it feels like clarity. That moment is the beginning of what an awakened empath actually becomes. Not the romanticized version, not the version the wellness industry sells you wrapped in language about light and gifts and divine sensitivity. The real version, the one that is quieter and stranger and far more difficult to explain to the people who thought they knew you. Most people who identify as empaths have spent their entire lives believing their sensitivity was the most important thing about them. It was the explanation for everything. Why they felt so exhausted after social interaction. Why they could walk into a room and immediately feel the emotional weather of everyone inside it. Why their relationships were always so consuming. Why they attracted people in pain. Why they could never quite manage to keep their own needs at the center of their own life. The sensitivity explained all of it. And for a long time, that explanation felt like enough. Then something shifts, and the shift is not gentle. What the shift feels like, before you have language for it, is a kind of betrayal. You have spent years honoring your sensitivity, protecting it, building your identity around it. You have read the books that told you it was a gift. You have sat in the communities where people like you gathered to affirm each other's softness, to validate the exhaustion, to call the overgiving a form of spiritual service. And then one day, without warning, you start to feel something underneath all of that. A question that the affirmations cannot answer. A question that, once it surfaces, you cannot make go away. What if the sensitivity is not who I am? What if it is what happened to me? That question is where real awakening begins, not in a yoga class, not in a moment of spiritual transcendence. It begins in the uncomfortable fluorescent lit interior of your own psychology, in the place where the flattering stories stop working and something more honest starts to take their place. Because the truth about most people who carry the empath identity is not that they were born with an extraordinary gift. The truth is that they were born into circumstances that made hypervigilance necessary. They learned to read the room because the room was not always safe. They learned to anticipate what others needed because meeting those needs was how they stayed connected, how they avoided conflict, how they earned the right to be present in spaces where their presence was otherwise conditional. This is not a comfortable truth. It is not the kind of truth that gets turned into affirmation cards. But it is the truth that actually sets something free. Because once you see the mechanism, once you understand that your sensitivity was a response to your environment, rather than a fixed feature of your soul, something remarkable becomes possible. You stop being a passive receiver of other people's emotions. You start becoming someone with a choice. That choice is the first real marker of an awakened empath. Not the absence of feeling, not the development of what people sometimes call thick skin, which is just another word for a different kind of armor. The choice is something more precise and more powerful than either of those things. It is the ability to feel fully and to decide separately, to register what is present in a room, in a relationship, in a conversation, and then to make a conscious decision about what you will do with that information. Not a reflexive response, not an automatic absorption, a decision made by you for reasons that belong to you. This distinction sounds simple. It is not simple. For someone who has spent decades confusing feeling with responsibility, confusing perception with obligation, learning to hold those two things apart is among the most difficult psychological work a person can do. It requires you to sit with someone else's pain without immediately reaching for it. It requires you to notice your own impulse to fix, to soothe, to take on, and to let that impulse pass without acting on it. It requires, in other words, a kind of presence that is actually harder than the automatic absorption you have always mistaken for empathy. Because what most unawakened empaths practice is not empathy. It is a trauma response dressed in the language of empathy. Real empathy, the kind that emerges on the other side of this awakening, looks almost nothing like it. Real empathy does not lose itself in someone else's experience. It remains present, it remains connected, but it remains itself. It is the difference between a therapist who sits with a client's grief and a person who drowns in it. One of them can actually help. The other is simply suffering alongside. The awakened empath learns to be the therapist in thy own life, not cold, not distant, not the kind of boundaried person who has simply replaced one set of walls with another, but genuinely present in a way that the old version of them never actually was, because genuine presence requires a self to be present from. And for most of their lives, the empath has been giving that self away one relationship at a time. What comes next in this awakening is not what anyone expects. It is not more peace. It is not more clarity, at least not immediately. What comes next is a reckoning. The reckoning does not look like a breakdown. That is the first thing to understand about it. From the outside, it can look like withdrawal. It can look like coldness. It can look like you have become someone who cares less, someone who has lost the warmth that people always said was your defining quality. Your phone sits unanswered for longer than it used to. You cancel plans without the elaborate guilt spiral that used to accompany every cancellation. You stop volunteering explanations for your choices. You stop over-apologizing for your needs. And the people around you, the ones who built their relationship with you on the foundation of your unlimited availability, notice. And they do not like what they notice. This is the part nobody prepares you for. The spiritual version of Empath Awakening sells you a story where the people in your life celebrate your growth, where your boundaries are met with respect, where the relationships that were draining you gracefully fall away and are replaced by deeper, more reciprocal ones. That story is a fantasy. What actually happens is messier and more painful and requires a kind of steadiness that you will have to build from scratch because nothing in your previous life trained you for it. What actually happens is that the people who benefited most from your old patterns are the first to tell you something is wrong with you. They will not frame it that way. They will frame it as concern. They will say, you seem different, seem distant, seem like you have changed. And they will say it with the tone of someone describing a loss, because for them, it is a loss. They have lost access to a version of you that was endlessly available, endlessly forgiving, endlessly willing to absorb their discomfort without complaint. That version of you was enormously convenient, and its absence is felt. What the awakening empath has to learn to do in this moment is one of the hardest things a human being can practice. They have to learn to let that be. To hear the concern, to feel the pull of the old guilt, the old reflex to reassure and smooth over and contort themselves back into the shape that made everyone comfortable, and to let all of that move through them without acting on it. Not because they are cold, not because they no longer care about the people in their lives, but because they have started to understand something that changes the entire architecture of how they relate to others. They have started to understand the difference between someone who misses them and someone who misses what they did for them. This distinction, once you see it, cannot be unseen. And it reorganizes everything. Because when you begin to look honestly at your relationships through this lens, you find something that is both clarifying and heartbreaking. You find that a significant portion of the closeness you felt, the warmth and the connection and the sense of being deeply known, was not closeness at all. It was usefulness. You were close to people in the way that a resource is close to the people who depend on it. You were valued in the way that something essential is valued, not in the way that someone irreplaceable is loved. And the difference between those two things is enormous. Now, here is where this awakening diverges sharply from what the competitor frameworks will tell you. Most content in this space stops here. It tells you to grieve the relationships, to let them go, to trust that better ones will come. And that is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete, because what it leaves out is the practical question, the question that actually matters if you are going to build a different kind of life rather than simply mourn the old one. The question is, how do you actually do this? How do you sit inside the discomfort of someone's disappointment without either caving to it or hardening against it? How do you remain warm and open and genuinely connected while also maintaining the new internal ground you have worked so hard to find? The answer is not a mindset shift. Mindset shifts are the wellness industry's favorite solution to structural problems. And this is a structural problem. It requires a specific learnable practice. And that practice begins with what you might call the pause before the pattern. Every empath has patterns, automatic behavioral sequences that activate the moment certain emotional triggers appear. Someone expresses disappointment, and the empath immediately begins managing it. Someone withdraws, and the empath immediately begins pursuing. Someone raises their voice, and the empath immediately begins placating. These patterns are so fast, so deeply grooved into the nervous system that they do not feel like choices. They feel like the only possible response. They feel, in fact, like personality. The pause before the pattern is the moment you create between the trigger and the response. It is not dramatic. It does not require meditation or journaling or any particular spiritual practice. It requires only one thing: the willingness to notice that you are about to do the automatic thing and to wait, to feel the pull of the old pattern without immediately following it, to sit for just a few seconds in the discomfort of not yet responding, and in that pause, to ask yourself a question that the old version of you never thought to ask. What do I actually want to do here? Not what will smooth this over, not what will prevent them from being upset, not what will preserve the relationship at the cost of my own honesty. What do I actually want to do? That question, practiced consistently, is the single most transformative tool available to an awakening empath, because it interrupts the automation. It inserts a self into the process, and a self present and considered and making actual choices is something the old pattern never had room for. But here is what you need to understand about the pause. It does not always feel like empowerment. In the beginning, it mostly feels like discomfort. It feels like you are being unkind. It feels like you are failing the person in front of you. The old guilt is loud and specific and very convincing, and it will tell you that the pause is selfishness, that a genuinely caring person would not need to pause, that your hesitation is evidence of the coldness people have been accusing you of. That voice is not the truth. That voice is the old structure defending itself. Learning to distinguish between genuine care and conditioned compliance is perhaps the most important skill the awakened empath develops. Not because care is bad, not because compliance is always wrong, but because until you can tell the difference, You cannot actually choose. You can only react. And a life built on reaction is not a life that belongs to you. The reckoning, in other words, is not the end of your sensitivity. It is the beginning of your authorship. There is a specific kind of loneliness that arrives in the middle of this transformation, and it is unlike any loneliness you have felt before. It is not the loneliness of being alone. You have probably been alone plenty of times and managed it fine. This is the loneliness of being in a room full of people you have known for years and realizing that none of them are seeing you. They are seeing the role. They are seeing the function. They are seeing the person you trained yourself to be in their presence over years and years of careful unconscious calibration. And the actual you, the one that has been quietly emerging through all of this reckoning and pausing and questioning, that person has not yet been introduced to most of the people in your life. That person is still new, still finding its footing, still learning what it sounds like when it speaks without apology. This loneliness is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is a sign that something has gone right. But understanding that intellectually and feeling it in your body at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night are two entirely different experiences, and pretending otherwise does nobody any good. The truth is that the middle of this transformation is genuinely hard. It is hard in the specific way that all transitions are hard, not because you are moving towards something terrible, but because you have left the familiar without yet arriving at the new. You are in the in-between. And the in-between does not have a map. What it does have, if you look carefully, are markers. Small, quiet indicators that you are moving in the right direction, even when it does not feel that way. The first marker is this. You start to notice what drains you before it fully depletes you. This sounds minor. It is not minor. The old version of you had no early warning system. You would give and give and give until you hit the wall, until the exhaustion became undeniable, until your body started sending distress signals that you had learned to override so many times that they had to escalate to get your attention. Fatigue became chronic illness. Sadness became depression. Anxiety became a permanent background frequency that you simply factored into your daily existence as though it were normal, because for you it had become normal. The awakened empath starts to feel the drain early. A conversation that would once have pulled you in completely now registers a quiet signal halfway through. Something that says, this is costing more than it is giving. Not a dramatic alarm. Not a reason to flee. Just information. Clean, specific, useful information that the old version of you was too busy performing to receive. And what you do with that information is up to you. Sometimes you will choose to stay in the conversation anyway because the relationship matters and the cost is worth it. That is a legitimate choice made by a person with full awareness. What it is not, and this distinction is everything, is an unconscious sacrifice made by someone who did not know they had an option. The second marker is equally quiet and equally significant. You begin to notice what you actually enjoy. This sounds almost embarrassingly simple, but for someone who has spent decades organizing their inner life around other people's needs, it is genuinely revelatory. Most empaths, when asked what they enjoy, will give answers that involve other people. They enjoy helping. They enjoy meaningful conversations. They enjoy being there for someone who needs them. And while none of those things are false, they are also not complete. They are the enjoyments of a person whose sense of self is still largely relational, still largely defined by what they provide rather than who they are when they are not providing anything for anyone. The awakened empath starts to discover preferences that belong entirely to them, interests that have no utility for anyone else. ways of spending time that are not in service of a relationship or a role or a sense of purpose. And in the beginning, these discoveries can feel almost illicit, like you are doing something you are not supposed to do. Like enjoying something purely for yourself is a form of selfishness that your old programming has not yet given you permission to release. That discomfort is worth sitting with, because on the other side of it is something that the empath identity in its unawakened form almost never allows. On the other side of it is a self that exists independently of its usefulness to others. Now here is the practical dimension that this transformation requires, and that most frameworks fail to provide. Building that self, the one that exists outside of its relational functions, is not something that happens through insight alone. It does not happen because you understand it intellectually. It does not happen because you have watched enough videos or read enough books or done enough journaling to know what the problem is. It happens through action. Specifically, it happens through the repeated practice of doing things that have no audience. This is more countercultural than it sounds. We live in a moment where nearly every experience is mediated through the question of how it will be received. What you eat, where you go, what you think about, what you are working through, all of it filtered through the consciousness of an imagined observer. For the empathist, tendency is amplified to an extreme degree. Not only are they performing their experiences for an audience, they are performing their healing. They are sharing their transformation. They are building community around their growth. And while community has genuine value, there is a version of this that becomes another form of the old pattern, the constant orientation toward others, the self defined by its reception, the growth that is always in self. Me subtle way for someone else. The practice of doing things with no audience is a direct interruption of that pattern. It means reading a book and telling no one what you thought of it. It means taking a walk with no destination and no phone. It means cooking a meal that you eat alone in silence. It means having a feeling and not immediately converting it into content, into a message to a friend, into a story you will tell later. It means letting your inner life be yours, unobserved, not performed for consumption. This practice feels uncomfortable precisely because it works. The discomfort is the gap between who you have been and who you are becoming. It is the sensation of a self that is used to being witnessed, learning to exist without witnessing. And every time you tolerate that discomfort without immediately filling it with connection or noise or the familiar comfort of being useful to someone, you are building something. You are building the internal architecture of a person who can be alone with themselves without needing to escape that solitude. That capacity to be genuinely alone without loneliness is not isolation. It is not withdrawal from life or love or connection. It is the foundation that makes real connection possible, because you cannot be truly known by another person until you know yourself. And you cannot know yourself while you are constantly outsourcing your inner life to the reactions of people around you. The empath who is not yet awakened is always, in some sense, living at the mercy of the room. The awakened empath has a room of their own, an interior space that belongs to them entirely, and that no relationship, however close, can colonize. This is what the transformation is actually building toward. Not a colder version of you, not a more defended version, a more inhabited one. There is a question that surfaces near the end of T, is transformation, and it is the most important question an awakened empath will ever sit with. It is not a question about boundaries or energy or which relationships deserve your presence. It is a question that goes deeper than any of those things and makes all of them easier to answer once you have faced it honestly. The question is this: now that you are no longer defined by what you give, who are you? Most people in the middle of this process avoid that question. They stay busy with the mechanics of the transformation, the boundary work, the relationship auditing, the practice of the pause, the solitude, the rediscovery of personal preferences. All of that is real and necessary work. But it is also, if you are not careful, another way of not answering the question. Because the question is not about what you do differently. It is about who you are when you strip away everything you were trained to be, everything you performed, everything you sacrificed yourself into becoming. When all of that is gone, or at least quieted enough to hear past it, what remains? What remains is the answer that this entire journey has been moving toward, and it is not dramatic. It is not a revelation delivered in a single moment of clarity. It arrives slowly, in pieces, through the accumulation of all the small choices you have been making. Every time you paused before the pattern, every time you sat with discomfort without immediately resolving it, every time you chose your own solitude over the noise of performing connection, every time you let someone be disappointed in you without dismantling yourself to fix it, each of those moments deposited something, a small, quiet increment of a self that is genuinely yours. And what you find when you finally turn toward that accumulated self and look at it clearly is that it has qualities you did not expect. It is calmer than the old verse, ion of view, not numb, not detached. Calmer in the specific way that a person is calm when they are no longer bracing for impact, when they are no longer scanning every interaction for signs of imminent emotional weather, when they no longer need the people around them to be okay in order to feel okay themselves. That calm is not something you manufactured. It is what was always underneath the vigilance, waiting for the vigilance to finally stand down. It is also more genuinely curious than the old version of you. The unawakened empath is often described as deeply curious about people. And that is true, but it is a specific and limited kind of curiosity. It is the curiosity of someone taking inventory, of someone assessing emotional states and anticipating needs and monitoring dynamics. It is curiosity in the service of management. The awakened empath develops a different kind of curiosity, one that is not in service of anything, a curiosity that engages with people and ideas and experiences because they are genuinely interesting, not because understanding them is necessary for keeping the peace or maintaining the connection or predicting what is coming next. This is the curiosity of someone who is no longer afraid of what they might find. And it changes every conversation you have, every relationship you enter, every room you walk into. And then there is this, which is perhaps the most surprising quality of all. The awakened empath becomes capable of a generosity that the old version of them never actually managed, despite a lifetime of overgiving. Because the generosity of the unawakened empath was never truly free. It was always entangled with need, the need to be needed, the need to be seen as good, as reliable as the one who shows up, the need to justify presence through usefulness. That entanglement does not make the generosity false exactly, but it makes it calm, blanketed. It makes it heavy in ways that both the giver and the receiver can feel, even if neither of them has language for what they are feeling. The generosity that emerges on the other side of this transformation is different in its texture. It comes from surplus rather than depletion. It comes from a person who has learned to fill their own interior life first, who has built the capacity to be alone and be well, who no longer needs the act of giving to tell them who they are. When that person gives, and they do give, often and deeply and with a quality of attention that most people rarely experience, it lands differently. It lands without the invisible weight of what it cost, without the subtle undertow of what it requires in return. It is, for perhaps the first time, simply given This is what the people who love the old version of you cannot yet see. They are looking at your withdrawal and your boundaries and your new unwillingness to be available at all hours, and they are reading it as loss, as diminishment, as the person they knew becoming somehow less. What they cannot see, because you have not yet fully arrived at it yourself, is that everything you are pulling back is being redirected. The energy that used to hemorrhage outward in all directions, absorbed by whoever was nearest and most demanding, is being gathered, consolidated, turned inward long enough to become something stable. And what it is becoming is the foundation of a person who will eventually be able to love them better than the old version of you ever could. Not because you will give more, but because what you give will actually be yours to give. There's one more thing that needs to be said, because most scripts about this transformation end in a way that leaves the viewer alone with their growth, as though becoming more yourself is a destination you arrive at and then inhabit in solitude forever. That is not what this is. The point of becoming a more inhabited person is not to need people less. It is to be able to meet them more honestly. The awakened empath does not graduate into isolation. They graduate into discernment. They become someone who chooses their people carefully, who shows up for those people fully, who can be genuinely present in a relationship because they are no longer secretly present for what the relationship does for their sense of self-worth. The relationships that survive this transformation, and some will, are different in quality from anything the old version of you experienced. They are built between two people who see each other clearly, who do not need each other to perform a particular role, who can tolerate each other's full complexity without flinching. Those relationships are rarer than what you had before, but they are real in a way that the old ones, for all their warmth and history and accumulated intimacy, often were not. What the awakened empath actually becomes in the end is not a better empath. It is not a more evolved or more spiritual or more psychologically sophisticated version of the person who walked into this transformation. What they become is someone who is finally, simply, undeniably present. Present in their own life, present in their own body, present in their relationships without the static of constant self-abandonment interfering with the signal. Someone who can feel deeply without being consumed, who can care genuinely without being depleted, who can be moved by the world without being swept away by it. That is not a small thing. In a culture that profits enormously from people who have lost contact with themselves, a person who has found their way back to their own interior is genuinely countercultural, not because they are trying to be, but because they are real, and real people who know who they are and what they will and will not accept. People who have stopped performing and started simply being are both rarer and more necessary than we are usually willing to admit. You did not choose to be sensitive, but you can choose what you do with it. That choice, made consciously and repeatedly, and with full knowledge of what it costs, is not the end of the empath. It is the beginning of the person the empath was always underneath.